May 10, 1774. The once magnificent body of Louis XV, King of France, lay rotting from within. Black pustules covered his face, unrecognizable from the handsome, well-beloved who had ruled for nearly 6 decades. The smallpox that killed him worked so quickly that his corpse became a biological hazard. That night, with only a single priest present, royal servants hastily entombed him in Saint-Denis Basilica. The man who once commanded Europe's greatest power was carted away like garbage, despised by his subjects and abandoned by his court. But how did a king once adored by millions become so reviled that Parisians celebrated his excruciating death? The answer reveals not just the fall of a man, but the collapse of an entire world order that would soon drown France in blood. The transformation of Louis XV from beloved monarch to despised tyrant represents one of history's most dramatic falls from grace. When 5-year-old Louis ascended to the French throne in 1715, Paris erupted in genuine celebration. Following the austere final years of Louis XIV's 7-decade reign, the cherubic child king represented hope and renewal for a war-weary nation. Contemporaries described the young king as uncommonly beautiful, with delicate features, magnificent chestnut hair, and eyes that spoke before he did. The Duc de Saint-Simon, that meticulous chronicler of court life, noted the boy's natural grace in everything he did. As Louis grew into adolescence under the regency of Philippe d'Orléans, the public's affection only deepened. During a severe illness in 1721, Parisians flooded churches to pray for their 9-year-old monarch. When he recovered, spontaneous celebrations erupted across France. The country had fallen in love with its king. In 1723, at just 13, Louis assumed personal rule, though he remained heavily influenced by his elderly tutor, Cardinal Fleury. These early years of his reign coincided with a period of relative peace and prosperity. France's economy stabilized after the disastrous Mississippi bubble financial collapse. The young king married Polish Princess Marie Leszczyńska in 1725, and she soon began producing heirs, further securing the dynasty's future. When Louis personally led troops to victory at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745, his popularity reached its zenith. The Parisians dubbed him Louis le Bien-Aimé, Louis the Well-Beloved. Yet beneath this golden exterior, a profound transformation was already underway. The shy, dutiful youth was evolving into something altogether different, a man consumed by sensual pleasures and increasingly disinterested in the burdens of governance. By the 1740s, Louis's marital fidelity had collapsed entirely. The king's appetite for new sexual conquests became legendary and public. His first official mistress, the intelligent and politically savvy Madame de Pompadour, maintained her position through extraordinary means, reportedly arranging a steady stream of young women to satisfy the king's insatiable desires when she herself could no longer physically accommodate him due to health problems. Most scandalous was the establishment of the Parc aux Cerfs, the Deer Park, a private brothel in Versailles where young girls, some reportedly as young as 15, were installed for the king's pleasure. Court gossip, amplified by an increasingly bold clandestine press, painted the king as a debauched libertine, spending France's treasure on personal gratification, while common people struggled under heavy taxation. This moral dissent might have been forgiven had Louis maintained France's greatness on the world stage. He did not. The 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, proved catastrophic for French prestige. Louis's vacillating leadership and poor choice of generals led to humiliating defeats by Britain's forces, both in Europe and across global colonial possessions. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 forced France to surrender most of its North American territories, including Canada and lands east of the Mississippi. The nation that had dominated European politics for a century now stood diminished and financially broken. As one anonymous Parisian pamphleteer wrote in 1764, "He was our well-beloved, carrying our hearts and hopes. Now he has gambled away our colonies, our honor, and our sons on foreign battlefields, all while coupling with his harlots at Versailles. He is beloved no more." The contrast could not have been more stark. A king who spent millions on his personal pleasures while his once great nation declined, who sequestered himself in Versailles while Paris seethed with discontent, who appeared increasingly indifferent to the suffering his policies caused. By the 1760s, the well-beloved had become the well-despised. But while the king's popularity crumbled, something far more dangerous was brewing in France, a revolutionary new way of thinking that would eventually consume not just Louis XV, but the entire system of monarchy itself. As Louis XV retreated into the pleasure-filled bubble of Versailles, intellectual Paris was experiencing a profound awakening. The Enlightenment, that great flowering of rational inquiry and critical thought, was transforming how Europeans understood authority, legitimacy, and governance. For an absolute monarch ruling by divine right, no development could have been more threatening. Coffee houses and salons across Paris hummed with dangerous new ideas. Voltaire, though initially an admirer of the English constitutional system rather than an advocate for revolution, nonetheless undermined the foundations of absolute monarchy with his penetrating critiques of religious intolerance and arbitrary power. His philosophical letters, 1734, presented England's more limited monarchy as superior to France's. Nace's absolutism, earning him exile but widespread readership. Jean-Jacques Rousseau struck even deeper at the heart of Louis's authority. His social contract, 1762, opened with words that must have chilled the king's advisers. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau rejected the divine right theory that underpinned the Bourbon monarchy, arguing instead that legitimate political authority came only from the consent of the governed, a concept fundamentally incompatible with Louis's understanding of his role. Perhaps most threatening was Denis Diderot's monumental Encyclopédie, published volume by volume between 1751 and 1772. This massive work represented nothing less than a systematic reordering of human knowledge, one that placed reason, not faith or tradition, at its center. Though careful to avoid direct criticism of the monarchy, the encyclopédie's emphasis on empirical observation and rational inquiry inevitably undermined the mystical foundations of royal authority. Louis XV's response to these intellectual challenges revealed his fundamental weakness as a leader. Rather than engaging with or co-opting these new currents of thought, he attempted simple repression. Royal censors banned books, closed publishing houses, and imprisoned authors. Voltaire was forced into exile. Diderot was briefly imprisoned. The publication of the Encyclopédie was repeatedly suspended. Yet these heavy-handed tactics only drove the philosophical opposition underground, where it flourished in the form of clandestine publications and secret reading societies. By attempting to crush the Enlightenment, Louis only gave it the allure of forbidden fruit and the moral authority of the persecuted. The king's vulnerability to criticism was dramatically exposed in 1757, when Robert-François Damiens, a domestic servant apparently influenced by religious and political grievances, attempted to assassinate Louis XV. The attack itself was hardly more than a flesh wound. Damiens stabbed the king with a small penknife, causing a non-life-threatening injury. But the monarchy's response revealed a regime acting from fear rather than strength. Damiens was subjected to the most extreme punishment in the French legal code, drawing and quartering. On March 28, 1757, in the Place de Grève in Paris, executioners spent 4 hours torturing Damiens before a crowd of thousands. They burned his flesh with sulfur, poured molten lead into his wounds, and finally tore his body apart using 4 horses. The philosopher Michel Foucault would later use this execution as the opening scene in his Discipline and Punish, presenting it as the epitome of pre-modern punishment's focus on the sovereign's vengeance rather than rehabilitation. This grotesque spectacle, intended to demonstrate the king's power, instead revealed his fundamental insecurity. As one witness, the adventurer Giacomo Casanova observed, "The people gathered not in fear, but in fascination, as though witnessing not the triumph of royal justice, but its desperate final performance." Public sympathy, surprisingly, leaned toward Damiens rather than the king he had attacked. Throughout the 1760s, the gulf between the monarchy and the intellectual currents of the age continued to widen. Louis XV became, in the public imagination, the living embodiment of all that the Enlightenment opposed: arbitrary power, inherited privilege, and government by whim rather than reason. Pamphlets circulated depicting the king as a debauched tyrant surrounded by corrupt ministers and grasping mistresses. The contrast with Enlightenment ideals of rational governance could not have been starker. The final blow to Louis's already damaged prestige came with the Maupeou crisis of 1771. The Parlement, particularly the Parlement of Paris, had emerged as centers of opposition to royal power. Though composed of hereditary nobles rather than democratic representatives, these judicial bodies nonetheless presented themselves as defenders of French liberties against absolutism. When they opposed the king's fiscal policies, Louis took the drastic step of dissolving them and replacing them with more pliant courts under his chancellor, René Nicolas de Maupeou. This constitutional coup destroyed what little institutional respect remained for the monarchy. Even conservative nobles now viewed Louis as a despot willing to upend centuries of French tradition to expand his personal power. Voltaire, surprisingly, supported the reforms, seeing the parlements as bastions of privilege and obscurantism. But the broader public interpreted the move as yet another example of the king's arbitrary rule. By 1774, as Louis XV entered his final months, the intellectual foundations of his monarchy had been thoroughly undermined. The Enlightenment had reframed the conversation about political legitimacy, and Louis had consistently placed himself on the wrong side of that conversation. He had become, in the words of historian Julian Swann, the perfect antithesis to the enlightened monarch. While other European rulers, like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, at least paid lip service to Enlightenment ideals, Louis remained defiantly anchored in an increasingly obsolete concept of divine right absolutism. But while philosophers debated the king's legitimacy in salons and cafes inside Versailles, Louis faced a more immediate physical threat, one that would ultimately send him to a painful, putrid death. By 1774, the 64-year-old Louis XV had physically declined from the handsome youth once celebrated throughout Europe. Though still regal in his bearing and meticulous in his appearance, the decades of excess had taken their toll. His once trim figure had grown corpulent, his famous eyes dulled by years of indulgence. Yet he remained in relatively good health for a man of his era, maintaining his rigorous hunting schedule and legendary sexual appetites well into his 7th decade. But beneath this veneer of vitality, the king was increasingly haunted by thoughts of mortality. The deaths of his longtime mistress Madame de Pompadour in 1764 and his son the Dauphin in 1765 had profoundly shaken Louis. The king, who had once scandalized the court with his libertine philosophy, now spoke frequently of damnation and divine judgment. As the Duc de Croix noted in his memoirs, His Majesty seems increasingly troubled by religious melancholy, speaking often of his sins and the hereafter, though these concerns do not yet extend to reforming his habits. Louis had particular reason to fear a violent death. The attempt on his life by Damiens in 1757 had left him jumpy and suspicious. He installed elaborate security measures at Versailles and travelled with increased guards. Beyond physical attack, however, Louis also feared disease, particularly smallpox, which remained endemic throughout Europe despite early inoculation efforts. The disease had claimed his grandson in 1761, his daughter-in-law in 1767, and his beloved daughter, Madame Adelaide, had barely survived it. The king was one of the few members of the court who had never contracted the disease, leaving him vulnerable in an age before effective vaccination. These fears would prove tragically prophetic in the spring of 1774. On April 27th, after returning from a hunt near the Petit Trianon, Louis complained of headache, fatigue, and chills. The king's primary physician, Joseph-Marie-François de la Saulne, initially diagnosed a simple fever and prescribed rest, but by the following day, Louis had developed a high fever and pronounced lower back pain, classic early symptoms of smallpox. The diagnosis remained uncertain until April 29th, when the first telltale pustules appeared on the king's face and hands. The court physicians, finally recognizing the gravity of the situation, made the official announcement: Louis XV had smallpox. The news sent shockwaves through Versailles. Those who had never had the disease fled immediately. Louis's daughters, the princesses Adelaide, Victoire, and Sophie, themselves survivors of smallpox, insisted on remaining to nurse their father, disregarding the risk of secondary infection. What followed was a medical horror show, documented in excruciating detail by the Duc de Croix and other courtiers who remained at Versailles. The disease progressed with unusual virulence, likely due to Louis's advanced age and the particular strain of the virus. By May 1st, the king's face had become, in the words of one witness, unrecognizable, a mask of confluent pustules, swollen beyond human resemblance. The pustules spread across his entire body, including his mouth, throat, and eyes. The royal physicians employed every treatment in their limited arsenal. They bled the king repeatedly, believing it would reduce the corrupted humors. They administered emetics to induce vomiting and purgatives to cause diarrhea. These treatments, far from helping, likely hastened Louis's decline by causing dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. They applied poultices of herbs and animal dung to the pustules, following medical theories dating back to Galen. The king's bedchamber soon reeked of bodily fluids, medicinal concoctions, and the unique, sickly sweet odor that smallpox victims emit as the disease progresses. By May 3rd, Louis was suffering from extreme thirst but could barely swallow due to the pustules in his throat. His eyes had swollen shut, and he lay in darkness, attended only by his daughters and a rotating staff of physicians. The Duc de Croix recorded that the stench had become so unbearable that incense burners could not mask it, and servants vomited upon entering the chamber. Courtiers who had spent decades competing for the privilege of attending the king's lever, morning rising, and coucher, bedtime, now found excuses to remain far from his chambers. On May 5th, in a moment of lucidity, Louis reportedly whispered to his confessor, the Abbé Maudoux, "If I recover, I swear to God I shall reform my kingdom and my life." But it was too late for such promises. The disease had entered its most virulent phase, with the pustules beginning to merge into large, suppurating sheets across his skin. Secondary bacterial infections set in, causing parts of his flesh to necrotize while he still lived. By May 7th, gangrene had begun to appear in his extremities. The smell became so horrific that even his devoted daughters could only remain in the room for short periods before needing fresh air. Louis drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally screaming in pain when awake. His famous last words, reported by multiple sources, carried a tragic self-awareness. "After me, the deluge." Whether this was a moment of political prophecy or simply the delirious mutterings of a dying man remains debated by historians. On May 10th, 1774, at 3:15 in the afternoon, Louis XV drew his final breath. The physician's official report stated simply, "His Majesty succumbed to confluent smallpox complicated by putrid fever." In truth, his body had become a battlefield of disease. Viral smallpox had opened the way for multiple bacterial infections, gangrene, and likely septicemia. The king who had embodied France's glory had died one of the most gruesome deaths imaginable. The body presented an immediate problem. Smallpox remains contagious after death, and the corpse was in an advanced state of decomposition. Traditional royal funeral customs, which included public viewing of the body and an elaborate procession, were impossible. Within hours of his death, Louis's corpse was sealed in a lead coffin filled with calcium oxide, quicklime, to hasten decomposition and reduce contagion risk. That very night, without ceremony, the remains were transported to the royal mausoleum at Saint-Denis. The funeral coach moved at a gallop rather than the traditional solemn pace, and crowds along the route jeered rather than mourned. As Louis lay dying, abandoned by courtiers who couldn't bear his stench, France held its breath, not in grief, but in anticipation. When news of his death finally spread through Paris on May 10th, 1774, the city's response revealed just how completely a king had lost his people. As word of Louis XV's death spread through Paris on the evening of May 10th, 1774, the response defied centuries of tradition. Rather than expressions of grief or solemn respect, the streets of the capital erupted in undisguised celebration. The Parisian police archives document a city transformed by macabre joy. Taverns overflowed with revelers, impromptu street parties formed, and makeshift effigies of the dead king appeared on street corners, some adorned with mocking inscriptions, "Here lies Louis the Last," and "The well-beloved has gone to hell." This unprecedented public reaction shocked foreign observers. The British ambassador, Lord Stormont, wrote to London, "I have witnessed a spectacle I could scarcely believe. The subjects of a king celebrating his painful death with greater enthusiasm than they would a military victory. When the funeral cortege passed, the common people sang and drank along its route. Such behavior would be unthinkable in England, even toward our most unpopular monarchs." The Austrian ambassador, Count Mercy d'Argenteau, reported similarly to Empress Maria Theresa. "The populace displays a joy so indecent that it borders on madness. They speak of the late king with an audacity that makes one tremble, especially considering what this might portend for his successor." This public jubilation was not limited to the lower classes. In the salons of Paris, intellectuals and aristocrats barely disguised their relief. The Marquis d'Argenson recorded in his journal, "At Madame du Deffand's gathering last evening, the announcement of the king's death was met with raised glasses and barely concealed smiles. The conversation quickly turned to hopes for reform under the new reign, with none pausing to offer even perfunctory expressions of regret. The clandestine press, already bold in its criticism during Louis's final years, now unleashed a torrent of invective against the dead monarch. Scathing pamphlets appeared overnight, with titles like The Whore's Lament and Divine Justice, How God Punished the Modern Sardanapalus. These works detailed with considerable embellishment the king's sexual excesses, political failures, and supposedly fitting end. One anonymous poem that circulated widely read, "Here lies Louis, called beloved, by flatterers in his pay, who lived like Tiberius and died like rotten prey. France breathes free at last, her tyrant in the clay." The most shocking aspect of this response was its open religious dimension. In a deeply Catholic country, many interpreted the king's gruesome death from smallpox as divine punishment for his sins. Parish priests reported parishioners declaring the disease God's judgment, and the pustules visible manifestations of his inner corruption. Some radical religious elements even compared Louis to the biblical King Herod, who, according to Acts 12:23, was eaten by worms as divine punishment. The authorities made half-hearted attempts to suppress the most extreme expressions of public joy. The Lieutenant General of Police, Antoine de Sartine, ordered his agents to tear down the most offensive placards and arrest street performers, enacting mocking skits about the king's death. But these efforts were perfunctory at best. As Sartine himself reportedly remarked, "To arrest all who celebrate would require imprisoning half of Paris." The contrast with Louis XIV's funeral in 1715 could not have been more striking. The Sun King, despite the unpopularity of his final years, had received elaborate obsequies lasting weeks with genuine public mourning. Louis XV, in contrast, was hustled to his grave with indecent haste. The traditional lying in state at Versailles was impossible due to the contagious and decomposed state of the corpse. The grand funeral ceremony normally held at Notre Dame Cathedral was reduced to a perfunctory service attended primarily by those whose positions required their presence. At Saint-Denis Basilica, the ancient burial place of French kings, the funeral oration was delivered to a half-empty church. The presiding bishop, struggling to find positive things to say about the deceased, focused on Louis's early years and piety in his final illness, rather than the 6 decades of rule between them. Even the official court mourning period was shortened, ostensibly due to the upcoming coronation, but widely understood as a tacit acknowledgement of the nation's mood. Perhaps most telling was the behavior of the new monarchs, the 19-year-old Louis XVI and his 18-year-old wife Marie Antoinette. Rather than displaying profound grief at the death of the young king's grandfather, they seemed eager to distance themselves from his legacy. Contemporary accounts describe them as visibly relieved when they finally left the smallpox-infected atmosphere of Versailles for the Château de la Muette. There, within days of Louis XV's death, they were already holding council meetings focused on reform, implicitly acknowledging how desperately the monarchy needed rehabilitation. Marie Antoinette, in a letter to her mother Empress Maria Theresa, dated May 14, 1774, wrote, "The new king seems determined to break with the ways of his grandfather. The nation rejoices at the old king's passing in a manner too." That would shock Vienna, but Louis XVI understands they celebrate not the death itself, but the hope for change it represents. This astute observation revealed the young queen's awareness of just how damaged the monarchy had become. For ordinary French citizens, the death of Louis XV represented not merely the end of a man, but the hoped-for conclusion of an era. As one Parisian shopkeeper reportedly told a police informant, "We do not celebrate the suffering of an old man, but the death of old abuses. May they be buried with him at Saint-Denis." This optimism would prove tragically misplaced. The young Louis XVI, though well-intentioned and morally upright where his grandfather had been dissolute, inherited a monarchy so deeply compromised that its redemption may have been impossible. The celebration of May 1774 expressed not just hatred for a departed king, but desperate hope for a new beginning, a hope that would ultimately be crushed in the tumult of revolution. While Parisians danced on what they thought was the grave of royal tyranny, they couldn't know that the hated Louis XV had left his grandson Louis XVI a poisoned chalice, a monarchy so damaged that its days were already numbered. The smallpox virus that killed Louis XV in May 1774 merely hastened a political death that had been decades in the making. The true legacy of his reign lay not in the manner of his passing, but in the irreparable damage he had inflicted on the institution of French monarchy itself, damage that would ultimately lead to revolution, terror, and his grandson's appointment with the guillotine less than 2 decades later. The most immediate inheritance Louis XVI received from his grandfather was financial catastrophe. The treasury Louis XV left behind was not merely empty, it was buried under a mountain of debt that consumed over half of annual tax revenue in interest payments alone. This fiscal disaster stemmed directly from Louis XV's failure to reform France's antiquated tax system, which exempted the wealthiest nobles and clergy while burdening the productive classes with crushing taxation. Multiple finance ministers under Louis XV, especially Machaut d'Arnouville in the 1740s and Étienne de Silhouette in 1759, had proposed vital reforms to broaden the tax base by reducing exemptions for the privileged classes. Each time, Louis XV initially supported these measures but retreated at the first sign of resistance from the nobility. The king's chronic inability to stand firm against entrenched interests condemned France to financial strangulation. The military humiliations of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, constituted another poisoned legacy. Under Louis XV's vacillating leadership, France had lost its North American colonies, seen its navy decimated, and surrendered its position as Europe's dominant power to Great Britain. Beyond the practical losses of territory and prestige, these defeats created a deep psychological wound in the French national consciousness, a sense of unjust humiliation that demanded redemption. This explains why, despite the dire financial situation, France eagerly intervened in the American Revolution beginning in 1778, seeking revenge against Britain regardless of cost. This intervention, while militarily successful, would add 1.3 billion livres to France's already unsustainable debt, a financial coup de grace that made the revolution virtually inevitable. Louis XVI thus paid the price for his grandfather's military failures twice over, first in the inherited humiliation that demanded vengeance, and then in the crippling cost of that vengeance. Perhaps most damaging was Louis XV's destruction of the monarchy's moral authority. The institution that had once claimed divine sanction now appeared to the public as merely human, and degraded humanity at that. As political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in 1762, "Kings wish to be absolute, and from afar men are told that their best interest is that this power should be absolute. But supposing this true, how can kings ensure that this power will not fall into unworthy hands?" Louis XV had provided a devastating answer to Rousseau's question by embodying those unworthy hands himself. When the 19-year-old Louis XVI ascended the throne, he inherited not just financial and military problems, but a fundamental crisis of legitimacy. The young king understood this, writing in his private journal shortly after his coronation, "What a burden I have inherited. I feel inadequate to the task of healing a nation so divided and distrustful." His intuition was correct. The damage was likely beyond repair. Louis XV's genuine attempts at reform demonstrate just how poisoned his grandfather's legacy had been. When he appointed the brilliant economist Jacques Turgot as Controller General of Finances in 1774, the new king gave him unprecedented authority to implement sweeping reforms. Turgot proposed abolishing internal trade barriers, reducing noble tax exemptions, and cutting royal expenditures, precisely the measures Louis XV had repeatedly abandoned, the foe. Yet these necessary reforms met the same fate under Louis XVI as they had under his grandfather. The entrenched nobility, the court factions, and eventually even Queen Marie Antoinette turned against Turgot, forcing his dismissal in 1776. Similar patterns played out with subsequent reformers like Jacques Necker and Loménie de Brienne. The structural resistance to change that Louis XV had failed to overcome proved equally insurmountable for his grandson. The crucial difference lay not in the king's intentions, the dissolute grandfather and virtuous grandson, but in the historical moment. Louis XV had squandered decades when reform might have been possible. Louis XVI faced the consequences when reform had become simultaneously more urgent and more difficult. As historian François Furet observed, Louis XV still had the authority to change France, but lacked the will. Louis XVI had the will, but had inherited a throne stripped of the necessary authority. This transfer of public hatred from grandfather to grandson represents one of history's cruelest ironies. Louis XVI, personally virtuous where Louis XV had been vice-ridden, frugal where his predecessor had been extravagant, faithful to his wife where the elder king had been notoriously promiscuous, nonetheless inherited the accumulated public loathing for the monarchy. The psychological mechanism at work resembles that of a child who suffers abuse from a parent and then transfers that rage to an innocent sibling. The target changes, but the emotional charge remains. By 1789, when the Estates General convened amid financial crisis, the monarchy's reservoir of public goodwill had been drained dry by Louis XV's decades of misrule. Even as the personally popular Louis XVI attempted to navigate the revolutionary situation, he found that the institutional prestige necessary for effective leadership had been squandered long before he took the throne. The question that haunts historians remains: could the French Revolution have been avoided had Louis XV governed differently? The counterfactual is impossible to prove, but compelling evidence suggests that timely reforms during the mid-18th century might have allowed France to evolve toward constitutional monarchy without violent rupture, following something closer to the British model. Had Louis XV supported his finance minister's attempts to rationalize taxation, had he maintained France's international prestige through better statecraft, had he demonstrated personal virtue that reinforced rather than undermined the monarchy's moral claims, in short, had he been a king worthy of his nation, the revolutionary explosion might have been averted, or at least moderated. Instead, when Louis XVI faced the Revolutionary Tribunal in December 1792, he stood accused not merely of his own actions, but of the accumulated grievances of his grandfather's reign. When the blade fell on January 21st, 1793, it severed not just Louis XV's head, but the final thread connecting France to its monarchical past, a thread already frayed to breaking by Louis XV's 6 decades of failure. The ultimate historical lesson of Louis XV's reign transcends its specific time and place. It demonstrates how leadership failure can destroy even the most entrenched and theoretically powerful institutions. The seemingly invincible French monarchy, with its claims of divine right, its centuries of tradition, and its unparalleled cultural prestige, proved vulnerable to the most basic failure: a leader who betrayed his responsibilities. Louis XV's body may have rotted from smallpox, but his reign had already decomposed from within long before, corrupted by indulgence, indecision, and indifference to his people's suffering. As we've seen throughout history, and continue to witness today, no power structure, no matter how ancient or divine its claims, can survive when those it governs come to despise those who govern. The most dangerous disease that killed Louis wasn't smallpox. It was hatred. And unlike smallpox, that disease has never been eradicated.